And now let's look at voluntary and involuntary comparison. So this is pretty important because this is also a topic in the different types of muscle tissues. And I have seen questions in TEAS 7 study manual on the difference between voluntary and involuntary. Okay, so here's a table to help you compare voluntary control and involuntary control. So voluntary control means you can control something consciously at your will, right? So for example, I want to move my arm, then I can move it, right? So that's under voluntary control. And how do you move your arm? How do you generate body movement? Through skeletal muscles, right? Okay, so skeletal muscles are under voluntary control. Now, in comparison, involuntary control, you cannot control a body part consciously. So it's the same as autonomic. Your body controls it without your will. So some muscle tissues and some organs are under involuntary control. They are on an autonomic control. And these targets or effectors are cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and glands, right? So think about this. Can you control your cardiac muscles? Not really, right? If you get very, very nervous and your heart is beating very fast, can you really tell your heart to slow down? You can't, right? Now, smooth muscles. We know that there's smooth muscle in the digestive tract, right? So let's say you get nervous, very, very nervous before a job interview, and you just feel like you have to go to the restroom. Now, can you consciously control your GI tract? Can you tell your GI tract, hey, don't, contract, don't make me want to go to the restroom? You can't really do that, right? So smooth muscles are also under involuntary control. And glands, that's pretty straightforward too, right? So think about your sweat gland. Nobody wants to look very sweaty, right? Can you tell the sweat glands not to sweat? You can't, right? So the glands are under involuntary control as well. So you may see questions on TEAS that ask you to identify whether this body part or a target organ or tissue is under voluntary or involuntary control. And I think I have mentioned this earlier in terms of examples. So yeah, skeletal muscles, that's body movement, and then cardiac muscles, heart beating, smooth muscles, organs and tracts, including blood vessels, and glands is associated with gland secretion. Now, one small thing I want to point out is that according to ATI, breathing is under involuntary control. I know that some of you have taken an A&P class, and you know that diaphragm is one of the main breathing muscles, right? And the diaphragm is skeletal muscle that you can control. You also have intercostal muscles that are also breathing muscles, which are skeletal muscles, which are under voluntary control. But for the most of the time, breathing is under involuntary control. It is autonomic, right? For example, when you're sleeping, you're unconscious, but the breathing still happens, right? Otherwise, you'd be dead in your sleep. So in that aspect, breathing is under involuntary control, although it does have some aspects of voluntary actions. But we're just going to follow what ATI says. So if you see breathing, it's going to be under involuntary control. Okay, somatic versus automatic. This is also an important topic in TEAS 7 for the nervous system. So for somatic, just associate this with skeletal muscles. And we know that skeletal muscles are under voluntary control, right? So for the somatic nervous system, for this particular division, things are controlled consciously or voluntarily. So you have motor neurons in the CNS that can voluntarily control skeletal muscles. So again, examples will be body movement, locomotion. Autonomic nervous system. It basically puts some of the functions in that autopilot mode. So you don't have to consciously control that. It's just happening, right? Without you consciously thinking about it. So that includes smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. Basically what we covered in that involuntary control category on the previous slide. So again, heart beating, right? And the contraction of organs and tracts, blood vessels, gland secretion. Okay, now for the autonomic nervous system division, we are going to further divide it into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So that's going to be on the next topic slide. But before we get to that, we're going to practice a little bit. Okay, so you're going to see a practice question, and again, you have 20 seconds to answer it. Okay, so I definitely provided more options than what you will see in the actual test, but this is good because we'll cover more actions to kind of help you distinguish involuntary with voluntary. All right, so which of the following actions are under involuntary control? A, oh, this is when you secrete saliva, right? Can you control the secretion of saliva? Not really. So it's gland secretion, so that's going to be involuntary. I'm just going to put an I there to stand for involuntary. Running, you can decide whether you want to run or not, right? A lot of times when the weather is crappy, I don't want to run, so I can definitely control that. And so that's a voluntary. Chewing, when you eat food, you want to chew, right? Your body cannot automatically makes you chew. So this is voluntary. And because you can control those chewing muscles, which are skeletal muscles. Dilation of pupil, this is under involuntary control, right? It happens automatically. When you're in a dark environment, your pupils will dilate, right? Because your body wants to have more light to see better. And when you say go outside and it's very bright, then your pupils will constrict automatically, right? So that there's not too much light going into your eyes to damage the photoreceptors. So that's going to be involuntary. Lifting weights, you're using your skeletal muscles. So voluntary. Heart beating, that's going to be involuntary, right? So your heart beats 24/7. Sweating, gland secretion, right? Involuntary. Digestion, involuntary. Okay, all right. Okay, now let's look at sympathetic and parasympathetic. So I definitely mentioned this in my previous TEAS 6 video, but just real quick, because this is a pretty important topic. Here's a table to help you compare sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. Now, both systems are part of the autonomic nervous system, but they are almost the opposite. The sympathetic nervous system performs this fight or flight response. So that's when there is unusual stimulus in the environment that causes a person to be emotionally or physically stressed or threatened. So for example, if you walk in the dark by yourself and there's some noise behind you, that will startle you, right? That will activate the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so remember that the sympathetic system is usually involved in these E division activities. So exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment. And there are some specific examples when the sympathetic response is activated. The pupils are dilated so that there's more light to go into your eyes so that you can see better, you can respond better. Increased heart rate, right, to pump more blood into your brain, into your skeletal muscles. Dilation of her bronchioles so that you can breathe in more air and oxygen, right, again, to support the brain and the muscles. Decreased mobility of the gut walls because you want to use all the energy to respond, right? You don't want to waste any energies for digestion, right? Functions that don't help you in emergency situations. Okay, now on the other hand, the parasympathetic is involved in this rest and digest activities. So these are going to be housekeeping activities to just maintain your daily necessary body functions and to conserve energy. And here are some examples of parasympathetic activities. So usually these are in the D division. digestion, defecation, diuresis. These are some specific examples, and they're almost the opposite of the examples for sympathetic nervous system. All right, so here's a practice question. Okay, Hannah watches a horror movie and a scene really scares her. She finds herself breathe faster, I'm missing an E here, and her body really tense. The hands are clenching tightly and are very sweaty. Which functional division of the nervous system is responsible for Hannah's response? So you can see this is kind of like responses that a person goes through in emergency situation, right? Because you're really scared. So this is going to be fight or flight response, which is generated by the sympathetic nervous system. So the correct answer is A. All right, so that's all the major topics in the nervous system. I know there are a lot of the different classifications, right, based on anatomy or based on functions. So I made this flow chart. This is also in my old video, the TEAS 6 video, but I want to show this again so that you have a very good idea of and all the different functions each division performs. Okay, so when we divide the nervous system anatomically, right, you have the central nervous system, that's going to be the brain, and the spinal cord. Okay. Now, beyond that, you have nerves, right, extending throughout your body to receive the information from the external or internal environment and send that sensor input into the brain. So that's going to be the peripheral nervous system. So nerves. So that's the physical anatomical divisions of the nervous system. All right, now when you look at the peripheral nervous system, it can be divided into two different sections. Sensory input, that's going to be afferent division, right? The information is going into the central nervous system to be processed. And usually those sensory information is collected by sense organs, like the skin, right? Like your ear, your tongue, your eyes. And the other section of the PNS is going to be the motor division. So the motor division is how you see the response, how you generate the response, right? Because this division receives efferent information, right? The information coming out of the central nervous system, and that's the command, right? Telling the effector organs what to do, what actions are needed. Okay? So this is going to be the response. And an action is going to be generated, right? It could be the secretion of a gland or the contraction of a muscle. All right, now when you look at the motor division, the efferent division, there are two different areas. The first one is somatic, okay? Because like I said earlier, the effector organ could be a skeletal muscle, right? Now, the skeletal muscles are under voluntary control. So that's going to be the somatic section. And some of the effector organs are under involuntary control, meaning they're autonomic, right? You cannot consciously control that. They're on autopilot. So cardiac and smooth muscles, as well as glands, are under involuntary control. Now, when you look closely at autonomic nervous system, it can further be divided into two divisions, right? If it excites, if it activates all your emergency response, that's going to be the sympathetic nervous system. If it calms you down, relaxes you, it just performs the basic housekeeping activities to maintain your body functions like defecation, digestion, that's going to be parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so that's all the classifications, all the different divisions based on anatomy, based on functions for the nervous system. All right. Okay, the next topic is going to be the structure of a neuron. So this is what a neuron looks like. And it's pretty similar to other cells. It's a little bit specialized, but it has most of the, the cellular structures. First of all, it has the main cell body. So this is the main cell body. And there's another name called a soma. And the nucleus is located in the cell body. So this is the nucleus. Now you can see there are some kind of almost like tree branches, right? These structures that really can extend from the cell body. So these are known as dendrites. So dendrites are the structure that receives the information from a previous neuron. Okay, so for example, this is part of another neuron. So let's say this is neuron number 1, and this is neuron number 2. If neuron number 1 is communicating with neuron number 2, then the information is going to be received by the dendrites of neuron number 2. So the dendrites are kind of like a receivers. Okay. All right, and then the neuron is going to process the information, and it's going to send the response to another structure known as the axon. So think of the axon as a very long tail. Okay? So the information is going to be transmitted through the axon, okay, to a third neuron, neuron number 3. So this is how neurons communicate with one another. They receive the information from another neuron by dendrites, right? And then they're going to send information to another neuron by axons. And when you look at axons, sometimes axons can be really long. And at the end, these are known as axon terminals. Okay? So usually in the axon terminals, there are vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. Right? So once the electrical impulses, which are known as nerve impulses, get to the axon terminals, it's going to activate the release of neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters are the molecules for communications. So the neurotransmitters can diffuse through the little gap between the axon terminals and the dendrites. And once they reach the dendrites, they're going to activate a series of chemical reactions. And this is how a second neuron receives that information. So it can be in both chemical form as neurotransmitters or electrical form, right? When the information is transmitted within each neuron, it's the electrical signal. Okay, so I have some more descriptions on each of the main structures. I did not include all the structures in this diagram because they're not mentioned in the TEAS 7 study manual. So I only included the major and more important structures that you need to know. All right, so one thing I need to point out is this term called a synapse. So the synapse is the site of communication between a neuron and its target cell. If we go back to this diagram, you can see these locations, right, where the axon terminals are very close to the dendrites, the site of communication between two neurons. That's a synapse. Now, of course, if you switch this neuron to a muscle fiber, now keep in mind that a muscle fiber is the same as a muscle cell. Okay? It's not a muscle protein fiber. It's just we have this special term for muscle cells. So I can switch this neuron to a muscle fiber, and this is also a synapse, right? This is how a motor neuron communicates with the muscle fibers that it controls. Which of the following structures are involved in the communication, which is a synapse? So I put it here. Now on a real TEAS test, you probably won't see this kind of clarification. So make sure you know that the site for neuron communication or communication between neuron and a muscle cell is called a synapse. So the structures are involved in communication at a synapse between two neurons. That's going to be the axon terminal, right, to release the information, and dendrites, right, to receive the information. So correct answer is C and D. Okay, next question. Which of the following is the chemical signal molecule present in the synapse? So I mentioned that it's going to be the neurotransmitter, right? And that's because within a neuron, it's going to be electrical signal, right? Nerve impulses, electrical impulses. But between the two cells, between two neurons, there's a little bit gap in there, and you can't really transmit electricity through the gap. So the best way to communicate is through chemical signals, okay? And then we call those chemical signals neurotransmitters. So if you recall, the neurotransmitter involved in muscle control is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine can diffuse and bind to receptors on a muscle fiber. And this is how a muscle fiber or a muscle cell gets excited and contracts under the control of the motor neuron. All right, so correct answer is C. All right, that's the end of this lesson. I hope the video is helpful. So I will see you guys next time, and thanks for watching.